don't want to buy that fruit anymore.
Yeah, I know.
I was so disappointed. I
Jack
thought I
called
was
me
doing
today.
something great.
Jack, you know Jack? Don't call him to move me to make start next month.
Oh, yeah?
How are you?
That would be a different
How are you hanging?
I get those ones, just take off the right thing and make them. Homemade, I made them, you made them.
You made them, that's right.
All right, it's time for us to begin.
I made them, they're homemade.
Go ahead, have our seats, and we'll get started.
Sign up to us. Right?
We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 13
Keep going.
tonight.
I can sit real snug.
Leviticus chapter 13, all about skin disease. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll get started. Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the blessing you've given us. We're thankful for your grace, your mercy, your presence with us. We ask, Lord, that you would give us wisdom to give some thought about what you're doing in these passages. And we just ask, Lord, that your understanding will be with us. And I pray, Father, for those who couldn't be today, your blessing and peace on them. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, chapter 13 is a long chapter. And we're going to get through all of it today because it's basically repeated formulae about what to do when someone has a particular type of skin disease. And then it changes tack at the end to something completely different and talks about contaminated fabrics. So we're going to deal with both those things. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. When a person has a swelling, scab, or spot on the skin of his body, and it may be a serious disease in the skin of his body, he is to be brought to the priest Aaron or to one of his sons, the priest. Now note this. This is not for a freckle. This is not if you know that you skinned your knee and it has a scab on it. This isn't, they understand that. And the Bible's not saying every time you get a scrape, you have to go to the priest and get it. This is something that is an illness or disease of some sort. He says, the priest will examine the sore on the skin of his body. If the hair in the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is in fact a serious skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean. But if the spot on the skin of his body is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is not turned white, the priest will quarantine the stricken person for 7 days. The priest will then re-examine him on the 7th day. I'm sorry, I lost my place. If he sees that the sore remains unchanged and is not spread on the skin, the priest will quarantine him for another 7 days. The priest will examine him on the 7th day. If the sore has faded and is not spread on the skin, the priest is pronounced him clean. It is a scab. The person is to wash his clothes and will become clean. But if the scab spreads further on his skin after he has presented himself to the priest for his cleansing, he is to present himself again to the priest. The priest will examine him. If the scab is spread on the skin, then the priest must pronounce him unclean. He has a serious skin disease. Now, why? And this basic pattern repeats throughout this chapter multiple times. Why is the Lord so concerned about skin diseases? You and I live in a time where we have vaccines. We have vaccines for things like smallpox and things like chicken pox and mumps and measles and all those kind of things. Some of those skin diseases, some of these things that manifest on people's bodies with lesions or sores were deadly back in the day. Most notably, smallpox, and second, the plague. There's a reason in Europe they call bubonic plague the Black Plague, because you have swelling, it would cause black spots under your skin. that in lymph glands and other places. And the plague was a deadly virus, and it's been around from the beginning of disease. And so these skin diseases were very serious to the Israelites because they might have foreshadowed a disease that would spread from person to person to person to person and cause an epidemic. Remember, they were traveling through the desert, about 2 million people, maybe from somewhere between 500,000 to 2 million. We're not really sure exactly the numbers. In close quarters. It's a large city traveling together, people living side by side, eating from communal pots, or actually eating manna most of the time, but still they're all in there tightly bound together. And if it was a disease like smallpox, it could kill a substantial portion of the people, disproportionately killing the young. And that would be a tragedy for any people. If you don't believe me, let's look at the history of our continent. From the best archaeological evidence we have, when in the pre-Columbian North American continent, there were about anywhere from 6 to 12 million people. That doesn't sound like much to us, and we have 330 million just in part of that continent. But that was, the population of the continent. Within 40 years of the Spanish discovering North America, Middle America, South America, the population of North America in particular had dropped from about 6 million to about 250,000. And it was not because the Spanish shot that many people. It was smallpox. Because the people in North America had no resistance whatsoever to smallpox, which by that time in Europe was the disease that people would get, and most people would get over in childhood. They only get it once, because once you get it, you don't get it again. But the Native American peoples had no resistance to it. And they died in droves. The Israelites were coming from Egypt, where they had probably developed over the 400 years in Egypt a resistance to most of the diseases that were there in Egypt, but they were moving into a new part of the world. Now, on our maps, it doesn't look that far away, but remember, this is a time when the fastest thing you could travel on was a horse. And most people never walked more than 30 miles outside the village they were born in. They were coming to a new place that might have had new germs and new pathogens that could have affected them in a terrible way. And God is putting in here a safeguard for his people. This seems to us when we read it today, gosh, is he looking for pimples? Is he looking for, no, they're looking for signs of those diseases that affect us with fevers and other things, but manifest in lesions on the skin. It was a public health law that God was putting in place for the Israelites.
And they had no treatments, no
No,
medical treatment.
no treatments. And so the idea was, if someone had a lesion that was more than just a scrape, more than a scab, more than something that you would get just in the regular day-to-day life. I mean, I always have a scab somewhere. I have one right here where my cat bit me the other day. And I have a mean cat. I was petting him, he was purring, and all of a sudden, all 4 feet and teeth. Just, hurt. But all of us, we cut our fingers, we stumble over things, we scrape our knees, we all get scrapes and bruises. This isn't, and the idea was if you had something, you went to them, they said, that's not a disease, that's a scrape, a scrape or a cut. And they let you go. But if you had something that was deep in the skin that caused the hairs to change color, which evidently was, to them was a sign of the disease ongoing there, and it was under the skin rather than right on the surface of the skin or a break of the skin so much. These are things that are common in all these passages I'm going to read through in just a second. But this was God's looking out for his people to preserve them from the plagues that hit so much of the world and continue to hit large portions of the world. It's God knew what caused sickness. I know germs hadn't been discovered by the scientists then. There were no scientists then.
So God created quarantine, designed it.
Exactly. Quarantine, those of us who have survived the COVID thing, to us quarantine's a nasty word. But quarantine saves lives. When you have an infectious disease that you don't have a cure for, it saves lives. And this is what God is imposing on the Israelites as if they get these diseases that manifest in lesions on the skin. I mean, think about your childhoods. So, what are you still in childhood? The rest of us may have to cast our minds back on ways to think about childhood. But, I remember, I'm just old enough that we had some vaccines, but not others. We didn't have a chickenpox vaccine when I was a kid. I had one chickenpox when I was 7 months old. Don't remember it, but my mother took me to the doctor, and I had one in the middle of my chest when I was 7 months old. Only one I've ever had.
I had the rest of yours.
But I did have shingles 40 years later, 45 years later, which comes from that chickenpox virus that lives in your body your whole life. And so you get these things. But chickenpox used to kill children. Not as much as smallpox. Now, I'm just old enough to have a scar on my shoulder from a smallpox vaccine. Not a big one. My mother's is about the size of a nickel. Mine is just a little bitty mark. Yeah. But, we had to be vaccinated. Nowadays, people don't get vaccinated for smallpox, but it's virtually been wiped out. There's still the rare cases that occasionally pop up. But this is, smallpox has killed millions of people in human history. And again, bubonic plague has killed hundreds of millions of people in human history. When bubonic plague hit Europe in 1348, bubonic plague originates in China. It spread east on the Silk Roads as the Italian merchants had gone over there to start bringing silk back to the west. It came east with them. It got on ships in Constantinople and spread to all of Europe. It killed more than a third of the people on the European continent between 1348 and 1380. It was bad stuff. The city of Florence in 1348 had a population of 100,000. In 1350 it had a population of 10,000 because 90,000 of the 100,000 had died of the Black Plague. Skin diseases. So when God is putting these, we read these in our modern times, if we're not thinking of it in the terms of epidemics, if we're not thinking in terms of serious skin-borne illnesses, or we think, why is God doing this? He's doing this to save his people, to keep them from epidemics. There's a reason that the Jewish people have survived from antiquity to the present, when most peoples who lived in those days have not. And part of it is in their obedience to the law, they have adopted standards of hygiene that were far in advance of most of the world's people for the last 3,000 years and more. And that's because God gave them a law that they followed that helped preserve them in this world. God sees through time. And he's protecting his people here. We may think of these laws as being restrictive and harsh, but every one of these laws is designed to do one of the very few things. One, show the holiness of God. That idea of cleanliness and holiness run throughout the laws of the Old Testament. Secondly, to preserve his people. Thirdly, to set his people apart from everybody else, that they might be uniquely known as the people of God. The dress laws, for example, have those at that end in mind. And so that is something we need to understand as we're looking to these Levitical laws, that they all had a purpose. Some of them may be a little misty to us because they're so far back in history. That's a culture that we don't live in, so we don't understand it as readily. But they all had a purpose. God does not move frivolously. And he gave these laws for a purpose. Verse 9, when a case of serious skin disease may have developed on a person, he is to be brought to the priest. The priest will examine it. If there's a white swelling on the skin that has turned the hair white, and there's a patch of raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic serious disease on the skin of his body, and the priest must pronounce him unclean. Now note in the translation I'm reading from, it doesn't use the word leprous or leprosy. The word leprous, it was a Latin term. That's not the word in the Hebrew. It's a word in Latin that means a lesion or a skin problem. It was a very generic term. And so that term was used in older translations every time it mentioned some kind of skin problem, leprosy. When we read in the New Testament people having leprosy, some of it may be the leprosy we think of. Hansen's disease is what I think they call it in the medical world. I am not a doctor, nor do I pretend to be. But it is, but in the New Testament and the Old Testament both, there are things that were virulent skin diseases that the King James would translate as leprosy. Whereas this is talking about lesions, or talking about sores that look a certain way. It's because that word that we, that the Latin Vulgate translated as leprous or leprosy just means a skin condition. You know, it's meant.
Did God just protect the priest while he didn't catch anything?
Well, I think the priest looked at the disease. They didn't touch it, you know, or they didn't.
But they didn't want it in their people.
You know, they weren't trying to doctor it. You know, they were just, oh, okay. And they were looking for these particular symptoms. You know, I don't know what diseases are being talked about here, but they were ones they would recognize as being something other than normal skin issues. Okay, again, if they had teenagers there and there were teenagers there, they would have pimples. This is not talking about pimples. This is talking about diseases that brought swellings in the skin or can cause cavities in the skin to develop. And these are things that are more serious than just acne. You know, but this one has, like I said, the skin is a white swelling of the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is a patch of raw flesh in the swelling. In other words, there's something red in the middle of it. I have no idea what that is. It is a chronic, serious disease on the skin of his body, and the priest must pronounce him unclean. He need not quarantine him, for he is unclean. But if the skin disease breaks out all over the skin, that it covers all the skin of the stricken person from his head to his feet, so far as the priest can see, the priest will look, and the skin disease has covered his entire body. He has pronounced the stricken person clean. Since he is turned totally white, he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. When the priest examines the raw flesh, he must pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean. This is a serious skin disease. But if the raw flesh changes and turns white, he is to go to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the sore is turned white, the priest must announce the stricken person clean. He is clean. When a boil appears on the skin of somebody's body, it heals, and a white swelling or reddish white spot develops where the boil was, the person is to present himself to the priest. The priest will make an examination. If the spot seems to be beneath the skin and the hair in it has turned white, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a case of serious skin disease that is broken out in the boil. But when the priest examines it, if there's no white hair in it, it's not beneath the skin but is faded, the priest will quarantine him 7 days. If it spreads further on the skin, the priest must pronounce it unclean. It is in fact a disease. But if the spot remains where it is and does not spread, it is only the scar from the boil. The priest is pronounced unclean. In other words, they're holding them for a period of time or checking them back again to make sure it's not spreading and going where it's probably not contagious. When there's a burn on the skin of one's body produced by fire, and the patch made while by the burn becomes reddish white or white, the priest is to examine it. If the hair in the spot is turned white and the spot appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a serious skin disease that is broken out in the burn. In other words, some kind of gangrene or something. The priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a serious skin disease. When the priest examines it, if there's no white hair in the spot, it is not beneath the skin, but it's faded, the priest will quarantine him 7 days. Now, one thing, every one of these talks about hair in the place. The Israelites must have been one kind of hairy people. If everywhere there was hair. They're always looking for that white hair, and they move. Some of us aren't that hairy. I don't know. Where was I?
27.
27, yes. The priest will re-examine him the 7th day. If it is spread further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is in fact a case of serious skin disease. But if the spot has remained where it was and is not spread on the skin but is faded, it is the swelling from the burn. The priest is pronounced unclean, for it's only the scar from the burn. A lot of this requires the priest to have some common sense. You have to look at it and say, okay, well, when a man or woman has a condition on the head or chin, the priest is to examine the condition. If it appears to be deeper than the skin and the hair in it is yellow and sparse, the priest must pronounce the person unclean. It is a scaly outbreak, a serious skin disease of the head or chin. When the priest examines this scaly condition, if it does not appear to be deeper than the skin and there is no black hair in it, the priest will quarantine the person with scaly condition for 7 days. The priest will re-examine the condition on the 7th day. If the scaly outbreak is not spread, there is no yellow hair in it, and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the person is to shave himself, but not shave the scaly area. This is like talking about on the face. And, women, most of the women didn't have to shave, some might have. But they would, the idea was that you can go ahead and shave, at that point. Then the priest will quarantine the people who has a scaly outbreak for another 7 days. The priest will examine the scaly outbreak on the 7th day. If it has not spread on the skin and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the priest is pronounced the person clean. He is to wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the scaly outbreak spreads further on the skin after his cleansing, the priest is to examine the person. If the scaly outbreak is spread on the skin, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The person is unclean. In other words, if it grows, then the priest knows it's the problem. He's unclean. But if, as far as you can see, the scaly outbreak remains unchanged and black hair has grown in it, then it is healed. He is clean. The priest has pronounced the person clean. No, healthy hair in Leviticus is always black hair, because all the Jews have black hair. They weren't blonde. Or the fact that a lot of Jewish people now have blondish or reddish hair has to do with having spent several centuries in Europe and people's behavior. But Back then, they all had black hair. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin of the body, the priest is to make an examination. If the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it's only a rash that is broken out of the skin, the person is clean. If a man loses the hair on his head, he is bald, but he is clean. I'm glad that he says that. But if there's a reddish-white condition on the bald head or forehead, it is a serious skin disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest will examine him. If the swelling of the condition on his bald head or forehead is reddish-white, like the appearance of a serious skin disease on his body, the man is afflicted with a serious skin disease. He is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean. The infection is on his head. The person who has a case of serious skin disease is to have his clothes torn and his hair hanging loose. He must cover his mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He will remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. That last line, until he's clean, he's not to be around other people. Why? So that other people don't catch him. Leprosy, or whatever it is they had. You know, whether it was smallpox or whatever. Last Sunday, Josh, was under the weather. He was coughing and had a cold, so he's better now. And he was wearing a mask, you know, or the mask we're so familiar with from COVID. And I've been reading in Leviticus. I think about, you know, keeping his mouth covered. And I thought, I'd be getting my bell out, you know, unclean. I didn't. But it was the idea again here. None of these people, and it doesn't say in any of these passages that these people have sinned and become unclean. This is really taking health precautions for God's people against those diseases that, when you're affected with them, produce swellings, produce sores, produce spots. You know, and again, the most common ones were measles, chickenpox, the smallpox, cowpox was not really harmful to people, but it did produce sores. And then the real killer, the plague. And so these were to keep people safe. Leprosy, probably very few of the people who were considered lepers in Scripture actually had what we think of as Hansen's disease. Because that term, leprous, meant any kind of skin illness. They could have had eczema. They could have had, you know, one of these things like chickenpox or whatever. And they weren't always going to be unclean. But if they did have leprosy, that was a lifetime thing. Unless they happened to meet Jesus along the road.
Were there a lot of priests? Or did one priest have to do that all day?
At first, it was Aaron and his sons. But his sons had sons. Because these guys were old when they started the trip. I mean, Moses was Aaron's younger brother, and Moses was 80 when the Exodus began. You know, until he was 40, he was a prince of Egypt. At 40, he murdered that overseer, and he spent 40 years on the backside of the desert. And when God spoke to him, he was 80 years old. By the time the Israelites got to the Promised Land, and he died before going into the Promised Land, he was 120 years old. He was a senior citizen. Aaron would have been older, because Aaron was a little older than Moses was. And so most of the people doing this examination would have been Aaron's sons, his grandsons, and possibly his great-grandsons. because the priesthood was all in the Aaronic family,
Yeah, right.
you know.
There probably weren't that many people with all these diseases either.
No, not at any one time.
No,
probably
that's right,
not,
yeah.
you know. You know, the one exception was the time, Israel had rebelled against God and a plague broke out amongst them. And God provided the healing by telling Moses to nail a bronze serpent on a pole, and people could look at it and be healed. That was a punishment from God, and that was a holy redemption from God. So that's a different story than this was just people in their years of wandering. And this law was to continue, and has continued to the observant Jews to this day in time. There was this real emphasis on cleanliness, on making sure you took care of your body, took care of your health, so that you preserved the community. Because we live in a culture that's very individualistic and focused on the individual. This was a culture that was more communal and focused on the group more than the individual. It was Israel who was on journey, and the different Israelites who were traveling made that up, but it was the totality of the people that God was preserving here. And then, chapter 14 is also about skin diseases. We may skip that next week. But the end of chapter 13 moves from skin diseases to clothing that's unclean. And there is a connection, isn't there? Because what's up against your skin? Clothes. And so you want to make sure that the skin disease wasn't caused by wearing dirty clothes all the time. Which, when you think about it, no washing machines. So all laundry had to be done by hand. People didn't own many sets of clothes, maybe two, because they were blessed. And they were traveling through a desert, they had very little standing water to wash clothes in. So it would have been difficult to do, have a regular weekly laundry day. But he gives his command in verse 47. If a fabric is contaminated with mildew, in wool or linen or fabric, in the warp or weft of linen or wool, or in leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination is green or red in the fabric, the leather, the warp, the wool, weft, and the leather article, it is a mildew contamination, and it is to be shown to the priest. Now, whether this means mildew as we understand mildew, or whether it's talking about mold, because I don't know, I've seen red mildew before, but mold can be any different color. And it's talking about things just really dirty, it starts growing on it. It is to be shown to the priest. The priest to examine the contamination and quarantine the contaminated fabric for 7 days. The priest is to re-examine the contamination on the 7th day. If it is spread in the fabric, the warp, the weft, the leather, regardless of how it is used, the contamination is harmful mildew, it is unclean. He is to burn the fabric, the warp or weft, or wool or linen, or any leather article which is contaminated. Since it is harmful mildew, it must be burned. When the priest examines it, if the contamination is not spread in the warp fabric, the warp or welt, or any leather article, the priest is to order whatever is contaminated be washed and quarantined for another 7 days. After it has been washed, the priest is to re-examine the contamination. If the appearance of the contaminated article has not changed, it is unclean. And even though the contamination is not spread, he must burn the fabric. It is a fungus on the front or back of the fabric. If the priest examines it and the contamination is faded after it has been washed, he is to cut the contaminated section out of the fabric, the leather or the warp or welt. But if it reappears in the fabric, the warp or weft or any leather article, it is broken out again. He must burn whatever is contaminated. But if the contamination disappears in the fabric, the warp or weft or any leather article which has been washed, it is to be washed again and it will be clean. Why? Because dirty clothes can carry germs too. This is not just that God's being a neat freak. I mean, he invented mildew. You know, he invented all these things. Is that he knows that people are walking around in clothes that are filthy. Not only do they smell bad, but they'll be carrying contaminants with them. You know, those of you who've ever had a mold problem in an office or in a home or someplace, you know it's not good for you. When it affects your sinuses, it affects, you know. And imagine carrying it on your body, wearing clothes that would fill with mold. Because we've got to understand, clothing in the ancient world was relatively, incredibly expensive. Because every single piece of clothing was made by hand. Every robe, every undergarment, everything had to be woven by hand. And not only did it have to be woven by hand, the material they used to weave it, the thread, you had to shear the sheep yourself. You had to card it out. You had to form, you know, the threads that you wove into these things. If you were, you know, they lived in Egypt. Probably much of the clothing they brought with them from Egypt was cotton, because cotton has been in Egypt forever. That's where cotton is original to Egypt. It spread to the rest of the world from Egypt. And they would have to clean out those cotton bolls and get the little seeds out of it and weave it into cloth. Incredibly intense labor involved in making cloth by hand. It's easier to make things out of leather, but even then, in leather, you have to kill the animal, you have to scrape the fat, you have to tan it, you have to find the right chemicals to turn just animal skin into leather, and it takes time and it takes effort. Everything they wore was hugely expensive in times of effort, in times of work, in terms of work. And most people didn't have more than 2 garments. You know? But who could afford it? You know, only the rich could afford to have a closet. There's a reason in old houses there aren't closets. Because who needed that much space for clothes when you just owned 2 or 3 shirts, 2 or 3 pairs of pants? You didn't need a closet for that. You put it in a box or a chest. You know, most of us have so many clothes we don't know what to do with them all. I know me, I have shirts in 3 sizes.
I was gonna say, they don't fit, why we have so many.
Right now I'm in my middle size. I had some that were much bigger when I weighed 60 pounds more than I do now. I have some that were smaller when I weighed 30 pounds less than I do now. And, you know, I keep them all because I don't know what size I'm going to be the next day. It's I have ridiculous amounts of clothes. I really do. And you probably do too. It's not, and most of the clothes I buy for $5. Because I shop at that Dillard's Clearance Center up in Jacksonville. And if I hit it with this shirt, $4.99. That's the deal. Of course, some of you may think you overpaid. But I think Robin thinks that you overpaid. But you know, golly. But still, we have so much because of machinery and modern technology. We have so much. They had so little. And this would have been heartbreaking to find that in one of their robes that there was something in it that made it unclean. You know what it would cause them to do? Take care of it.
My translation says plague.
What? Plague, yeah. Yeah. It's,
For reddish, for greenish or reddish in the garment,
yeah,
it's called a plague.
yeah.
So
It's a very difficult Hebrew word to translate. You can
Right.
translate it plague, you can translate it infection or spreading thing, it's just because, again, their language was not as technical as ours is, because we have, 3,000 years of science, where we differentiate things into categories and all this kind of stuff. We have the dadgum Greeks to thank for that.
But if anyone had those sores and stuff, they would get onto the clothes.
It would, absolutely would. And so you don't want to wear something that is infected.
Mm.
And again, it's for health.
Right.
It's not for fashion, it's for health. God is watching out for his people. And the laws he gives them, we read them and we think, gosh, there's a lot of rules, a lot of laws. But there was a purpose to every one of them. Some to show their need for forgiveness, all those sacrifices. These to preserve their health, so that when they reached Egypt, and for the generations to follow, they had practices and hygiene that would preserve them in a filthy world. God was caring for his people in the law. Any further questions? How do we apply it to us? Well, wash your face, wash your hands. Don't go around, if you're sick and coughing, and you're coughing into your shirt, wash your shirt. Take those normal precautions that we know about now, because we're living in the age of scientific marvels. Take those precautions. Pay attention to good hygiene and good health practices. And preserve yourselves and the people around you. If you're coughing and you got the crud or you got a disease, stay home. Don't share. Don't share. The first time I got COVID was at a funeral. A lady had passed away, and her funeral was at Spruce Creek Baptist Church. She had been the treasurer for our association for years. And I was very active in the association, as I am now. And so I went to that funeral. One of my good friends preached that funeral. I sat between two more friends of mine who were good, dear friends. And behind us was our new DOM, Glenn Rogers, who we had not yet merged in, but he was sitting behind us. Of the 5 preachers I knew there, 4 of us got COVID that day. The one who didn't was the guy who had had COVID 3 weeks earlier, who was sitting to my left. But somebody was coughing, don't know who. There were no masks. There were no precautions taken. Of the 4 of us, 3 of us ended up in intensive care. I didn't. I was the blessed one. Now, I had also had a vaccine, the other 3 hadn't. But, those 3 of those guys ended up in intensive care. And one of them, a good friend of mine, was put on a ventilator. And when he recovered, the nurse in the hospital said, somebody's watching out for you, because you're the only person we've put on a ventilator that has survived. But he did. And I was watching out for him. He's still serving the Lord. But, people, we need to take sensible precautions. Don't not live in fear, but take sensible precautions.
There was a story on the news this morning about people that like to carry around their water cups with them. And they got water cups from 3 different people and said, how often do you wash your water cup? Well, this one man said he never washed it. Well, they sent them all to labs and did little samples of them and put them in a little petri dish to see what grew, and all of them grew stuff.
Yeah,
I didn't
yeah.
know quite what it was, but they all grew
I
stuff.
know, I have like 30 coffee cups in my office. A couple of them look like science experiments right now. You know, that I didn't finish the coffee, and I forgot it was there, and I set it off to the side somewhere, and I come back to it later, and it's breathing. What is this? But, typically when I get one of those, I just throw it away. It's not gonna work. But it's I get a lot of gimme coffee cups. But we need to take, be sensible for others' sakes as well as our own, and take care of ourselves. God wants us to take care of ourselves. He gave rules for his people that they could be clean and could be in good health, and we should strive that too. Now, praise God, Jesus has come and has given his life for us and been raised from the dead, and if we get sick and we perish as a believer, we know that's the good news. We get to go with the Lord. But he wants us here. If he didn't want us here, we wouldn't be here. He wants us here, and he wants us to be witnesses, and he wants us to serve, and he wants us to do what he would have us do. And so we ought to honor his desire for us and do our best to stay healthy, which means I need to lose about 70 pounds, but maybe more than that. But this is,
We won't give you broken cookies.
we need to pay attention to those kind of things. All right.